So one of the things we're going to be doing a great deal with most of our microservices is reading and writing JSON and a few other common tasks. And it might be useful at this point to actually write some helper functions to read and write JSON at least. So back in the broker service folder, in the CMD API, I'm going to create a new file in there called helpers.go. And if you've taken other courses from me, you're familiar with what I'm about to do. So this is in package main. And I'm going to put, if I go back to handlers.go, I'm going to take this type definition, JSON response, and I'm going to cut it out of there. And I'll put it over in helpers.go instead, okay? Because this is where we're going to be using it most of the time. So we're going to want 3 functions in here at least. One to read JSON, one to write JSON, and one to generate a JSON error response. So let's get started with reading JSON. So I'll declare a function. I'm going to make this have the receiver of app pointer to config. And I'll call this one read JSON. And it will take as parameters a response writer, http.responseWriter. It will also take the request, which I'll call R as I normally do. And finally, it will take data. And I'm going to use the Go 18 or 1.18 syntax of any. And if you're not using that, if you're using an earlier version, you'll have to put interface like this, okay? And I'm going to stop telling you that eventually. But I'm using Go 1.18, so I can use any. And it potentially returns an error. Now, I'm also going to make a limitation on the size of an uploaded JSON file. And I think 1 megabyte is bigger than it's ever going to have to be. So I'll call this max bytes. And I'll make it assign it the value of 1048576. Okay? So that's 1 megabyte. And now I'll get the R body. R body is equal to http.maxbytesReader, and I'll pass it w and r.body, and then I have to cast it to int64 because that's what this particular function requires. Int64 max bytes. And now I'll create a decoder, and this is standard stuff if you've worked with JSON in Go at all. JSON.newDecoder, and I'll give it r.body. And I'll check for an error when I call dec.decode, and I'm going to decode into data. And we'll check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then I'll just return the error and not go any further. But if I get past that, there's one more check I want to run here, and that is that there's only a single JSON value in the file that we received. So I'll say error is now equal to dec.decode again, and I'm going to pass it a reference to a struct with 2 sets of curly braces, okay? And if error is not equal to, and in this case I'm checking for io.eof, end of file. If it's some other error, then I'll return errors.new, and I'll just say body must have only a single JSON value. Otherwise, if everything went according to plan, I return nil. Now there's a function I can call to read JSON anytime I want to, and it's going to be extremely helpful to have that as time goes on. We also, of course, want to be able to write JSON, so let's write a function for that. Function app receiver of app of type config. That's better. And we'll call this one write JSON. And it requires the response writer, which I'll call w, response writer. It requires some status, which is going to be an int. What's the status code we want to send back? Data, and again, I'm going to use any. And potentially it will have headers. And I'll make that variadic, ... http.header. And it potentially returns an error. And this is very simple. So we'll create a variable called out, and we'll check for an error when we call json.marshal data. And we check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, and just return the error. But if we get past that, we now have to check to see if any headers were included as the final parameters to this function. And we do that by saying if the length of headers is greater than 0, then we have some headers to add. So for, key, and value are populated when we call range headers. And we're going to range headers at index 0. Okay? And if we have something in there, we just say w.header at key is equal to value. That's all there is to that. Okay? Now we set the content type, w.header.set, and we'll set content type, content-type, to application/JSON, which I have to spell right. And we set the status, w.writeHeader, and we'll write status, which is just an integer value. And now we ignore the first return value, but I'll check for an error when I call, and it's not an assignment operator, it's an equals operator, w.write out. If there's an error, if error is not equal to nil, then return it. Otherwise, just return nil. Okay, so now we can read JSON, and we can easily write JSON. And now the last one I want to add for now is error JSON, which will write an error message as JSON. So func, again with the receiver of app pointer to config, and I'll call this one error JSON. And it will take W, which is the HTTP response writer. It requires an error of type error, and potentially a status. Variadic again, this time it's an int. And it potentially returns an error. And this is very simple. We'll set status code by default to be equal to http.status-bad-request. And that's what the status will default to if it's not specified in the call to this function. So we'll check to see if status has been specified. If the length of status is greater than 0, then somebody specified it. So status code is now equal to status at index 0. And now we just declare a variable payload. And this is of type JSON response, which is right at the top of this file. And we'll say payload error is equal to true. And payload.message is equal to err.error, which we get as a string. And we return app.writeJSON. And we give it W and status code and payload. And that's all there is to it. So this will make our lives easier. So if we go back, for example, to handlers.go in this same folder, here we're writing this information out. And now we can simplify this simply by saying, we'll ignore the error, is equal to app.writeJSON, W, http.status OK, and our payload. So I should be able now to get rid of all of this, and that's a much shorter function. Okay, well, that's enough for this time around, except that I have to save this to get rid of encoding JSON. That's much better. That's enough for this time around. In the next lecture, we'll simplify our lives a bit by using a makefile.